Hey everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. So Starlink wants another bite at the RDOF apple. Be right back. Hey, thanks for joining me. Rick Uzzi here with Broadband Deployment News. So as you may know, the FCC denied the long-form application of Starlink, which is the low Earth orbit satellite service, and this is for the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. So Starlink bid on that. They won about $885 billion in that, and there was a lot of controversy about that. Could they deliver? There were a lot of people lobbying against them, and the FCC eventually, even though they first had come out and said yes, low Earth orbit satellites can bid in this, and it looks like the technology based on the short form application that Starlink provided, so it looks like this is good. But when the long form application came out, they denied it, and they listed several reasons. But I think they were swayed a lot by the lobbying, so Starlink has appealed this ruling. So I was going to walk through some of the highlights of their document where they appealed this. And I think they make some good points, I have to say. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here as to whether the FCC changes their mind on this. So let's take a quick look at what they filed here. So you see request for confidential treatment, and then application for review in the long-form application of Starlink Services, Inc. So the first part of this is about treating information confidentially in here, and you can see as I'll go through this that there's lots of redacted information in here. So I think that's what that's about. We're making a case that the redacted information maybe should stay redacted. And maybe they provided an unredacted version and said, please redact these details. So first, we start out kind of with a summary letter here. Starlink Services hereby submits the attached application for review of the Bureau's, and this is really the Wireline Competition Bureau, or that part of the FCC, decision to deny SpaceX's long-form application form to obtain support for its winning bids in the RDOF auction. And then they go through all these, here's why we think everything should be redacted and whatnot. And blah, blah, blah. I'm just going to zip through that. And then we get to their the actual filing here, application for review of Starlink Services, Inc. And then I have an executive summary. I'll go through some of this, and I'm going to go through some of the more details, which provides some more details on some of these items. So the Wireline Competition Bureau's decision to exclude Starlink from RDOF is flawed as a matter of both law and policy. So they're really focusing on the law, and they're focusing on what was originally specified as far as RDOF goes, and then the policies that the FCC has followed and that they said they would follow. And are they applying these things equally, or are they singling out Starlink for reasons that they shouldn't be singled out for? So it fails legally because it contradicts the record, including SpaceX's and Starlink's proven capabilities. It contradicts the Commission's stated rules for the program, and it rests on unsupported conjecture and outside the record information apparently cherry-picked from somewhere on the internet. So again, there were a lot of people lobbying against Starlink because they didn't like the fact that Starlink had satellites that were really already up there, and they were looking to get funding. So it's not like they had to go then build out a fiber network, and they were also concerned, hey, this is a low Earth orbit satellite. It's going to be limited in speed. It'd be much better to get fiber in these areas if fiber can be done there, and that's true as far as speeds with low Earth orbit satellite. It's much better than geostationary, and the latency is fine relative to the requirements for RDOF. But yeah, if you can do fiber, it's much better to do fiber. But the way that their applications were completely denied, they make some good points in this. And people were lobbying at the Fiber Broadband Association, I think, and maybe NTCA together filed this long report explaining pulling information and saying here's why we don't think this is a good technology and why we think they're not going to make it work financially over time based on the cost of satellites and all kinds of things. So that's probably the outside conjecture they're talking about, and cherry-picked information from the internet. Also Ookla speeds, that could be part of this. Well, it's definitely part of this, but they're talking about that, I think, there as well. So worse, it fails the RDOF's very purpose, closing the digital divide. The Bureau's decision undermines this goal, leaving the very Americans that RDOF was supposed to connect stranded indefinitely on the wrong side of the digital divide. This decision is so broken that it is hard not to see it as an improper attempt to undo the Commission's earlier decision, made under the previous administration to permit satellite broadband service providers to participate in the RDOF program. And so that's a point to be made there, in that, there's every time there's a change in administration, FCC people change. So this was under the Trump administration originally. This RDOF program was designed, and they looked into it and got a lot of information about low Earth orbit satellites and decided, okay, you can go ahead and participate. They looked at the latency. That was a question, but that was overcome. But they obviously said that you can't participate in the gigabit tier because it's just not going to happen with low Earth orbit satellite with any technology that we know of right now. The decision appears to have been rendered in service to a clear bias towards fiber rather than a merits-based decision to actually connect unserved Americans. Commissioner Starks, in adopting the RDOF order, correctly foresaw that the next generation satellite broadband holds tremendous technological promise for addressing the digital divide and is led by strong American companies with a lengthy record of success. Rightly, he directed the Bureau to evaluate those applications on their own merits. But the Bureau inexplicably ignored this direction and instead applied far different standards to SpaceX's application, precisely because SpaceX proposes to use satellites. Among many other errors, the Bureau's decision improperly misused data outside the record to penalize SpaceX alone for its system's current speeds, which are irrelevant to whether SpaceX can meet RDOF speeds. RDOF speed requirements, starting 3 years from now. So they're saying basically they're looking at the speeds now, but the speeds that Starlink needs to meet are really going to be 3 years from now. RDOF was, by design, meant to provide funding and time for participating service providers to meet these requirements. Indeed, most RDOF applicants currently provide no service in many of their RDOF areas today. The fact the Bureau relied on unauthorized outside speed tests without even notifying SpaceX that its decision was based on these tests only compounds the error. I had ignored robust record evidence of SpaceX's proven ability to quickly expand and upgrade its network. SpaceX, an unmatched ability to deploy its satellites, and has enabled SpaceX to launch over 3,000 satellites to date. SpaceX's satellites have also operated with over 99% reliability since being licensed by the FCC in 2018. It says they failed to accurately contrast SpaceX's transparent all-in pricing. It says here, SpaceX never claimed it would use its current pricing in the RDOF territories. Indeed, by law, it cannot. SpaceX, unlike other RDOF bidders, fully discloses its true cost to consumers with no hidden fees, no installation costs, no perpetual equipment rentals, no early termination fees, no ballooning promotional prices, etc. And those are all issues with some providers of broadband, in that you perpetually paying for a cable modem or some other device at the home. Yeah, they give you a year at a certain price, and then it balloons after that. Other kinds of hidden fees, installation costs. But that's not the other people that bid on RDOF. It's not saying that they're going to do that on their RDOF deployments. It's not like saying, well, they're going to continue to do that. So you can't really say, well, SpaceX. They're just making a point here that I think that they've got transparent pricing now, and some of these others don't. But that doesn't mean that these others will not have transparent pricing when they do their RDOF. The Bureau's decision to hold SpaceX to standards not adopted by the Commission for the RDOF program. Changing the rules to undo a prior policy is grossly unfair after SpaceX has invested thousands of employee hours and millions of dollars preparing to meet its RDOF obligations, on the reasonable assumption that the Bureau would apply the Commission's rules in an even-handed manner. Far more troubling, as no RDOF applicant offering fiber even bid in the majority of the territories SpaceX committed to serve through RDOF, the Bureau decision leaves the Commission with no plan to connect many unconnected Americans, undermining the very purpose of this program. The decision should not be allowed to stand, leaving the people in these rural areas across our country behind yet again. A couple of things to say about that. It's interesting that they're saying not that maybe a fiber provider bid and Starlink bid and Starlink won because they were able to beat the bid, but they're saying, and I think we'll see it here in a minute, in over 50%, just over 50% of the areas that there was no fiber bidder there. So that might mean that in future kinds of funding opportunities, maybe through the IIJA and the BEAD program, that maybe somebody won't bid there, because these could be areas where it's like, it's on the top of a mountain. And there's three houses on the top of a mountain. Is it going to pay to run fiber all the way up there? So that might be a good point there. And what else did it say here? Many unconnected, undetermining the very purpose of programs. Okay, I had another point. I can't remember what it was, but So that point is valid, but then again, there could be money that is coming down the road that now, with, when RDOF happened, there was no BEAD money sitting out there. So now with all of this BEAD money out there and a lot of focus on fiber, there could be people that would be bidding in these areas. Oh, the other thing I was going to say was that, unlike fiber, where you're saying there's 3 people on top of a mountain, and now because Starlink didn't get this money, these people will be left out in the cold. It's not like a fiber operator who didn't get the money, like LTD Broadband, for example, was going to do fiber, let's say fiber and wireless. I forget what they were doing. But so let's say a fiber provider didn't get the money. Well, then they're not going to build that infrastructure, right? But in this case, the satellite's already up there. So if there's already a satellite, there's already a constellation up there over that mountain with those 3 customers. So people can get the service. It's just that they're going to pay the standard Starlink prices for that. So you're going to have to pay the $600 or so for the antenna that they have to have on their house, and then the monthly recurring fee, which I think is around like $100 a month or something. So it's not going to be cheap. And I don't know what Starlink was going to do with RDOF funds, if they were going to try to subsidize it in some way or how that was going to work. Because again, I'm assuming they're also going to use those dollars to help increase the number of satellites that they have in their constellation, specifically in the areas where they won support. However, that could be spread around the country, so I don't know how that works. But in any event, it's not like these people are left out of the cold. So the Starlink service is still available to them. So that's an interesting point there as well. Then there's the actual document here in addition to that executive summary. So I'm going to pull a few points out of here as well. Application for review of Starlink services. And here's where you start to see redactions. The Bureau relied on current nationwide speed tests that have no bearing on future speeds in RDOF territories. SpaceX has no obligation to meet any speed requirements for more than 3 years. And that's true in that, let's say you've got an area that's got DSL right now. Let's say CenturyLink or somebody's got DSL in an area and they win RDOF funds. Well, you're not going to be basing whether they can provide service at, let's say, gig speeds. Let's say they bid in gig symmetrical. You're not going to base that on what their DSL speeds are now. So that's kind of a good point that they're making there, is that, we've got 3 years to hit these speeds. Even though they have satellites up there now, they can increase the capacity they have. Not one RDOF recipient is currently meeting its speed requirements throughout its awarded areas, because the whole point of RDOF is to enable recipients to build out new networks, which takes years. And that's a good point. And really, there are a lot of areas where Starlink could be offering the tier that they bid on, which is 100 by 20, very, very quickly. It might be that they just need to get some more satellites up in that area and they could meet that. So they make a good point there. Background, founded in 2002. So they make some points here on the fact, trying to make some points here that they're a strong company with a proven track record. So founded in 2002, SpaceX has an unparalleled record of innovation and success in space launch. For example, in 2020, SpaceX returned to the United States the ability to fly humans into space, a capability for which the country had to rely on Russia after the space shuttle was retired in 2011. SpaceX remains the only American ride for humans to space. That's a great point, not necessarily for this, but I just think that's great that SpaceX was able to do that, because you hate having to rely on Russia to get Americans into space. SpaceX has also created Starlink, the world's first high-speed, low-latency satellite internet service with over 3,000 satellites in orbit and ground infrastructure around the world. And that's a really good point specifically to this, in that they're definitely a technology leader. I mean, you got to give them props for being the first to really go all in on this low Earth orbit satellite technology. Starlink is actively serving hundreds of thousands of users in 49 states, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. That's a good point. They're already serving lots of customers, but again, this goes to the point that these people are not left out in the cold. They're assuming if they're getting the satellite service that they're in an unserved area where you don't have much in the way of broadband, so they're getting it from Starlink, which is great. But the fact that Starlink's not going to be getting funds for these areas where they won doesn't necessarily mean that those people can't get broadband, because they still can get Starlink most likely. They mentioned a few things: the Ho tribe in rural Washington, Cherokee Nation tribe in rural Oklahoma. They've got service now. The restored connectivity areas affected by natural disasters, from Hurricane Ida in Louisiana to tornadoes in Kentucky to the tsunami in Tonga. When the Ukrainians needed a way to stay connected during the Russian invasion, Starlink answered the call. And these are all great points that Starlink can quickly and easily step in areas where, again, they've got the technology up there. The satellites are in the air, and they can get broadband deployed very quickly in different areas. SpaceX is now valued at $125 billion, making it among the most valuable companies in the world. Let's see, let's go through some of this. You start to see the redactions. Provided substantial evidence, including speed tests. So they're talking about what they provided here to the FCC in order to make their case. They provided substantial evidence, including speed tests, demonstrating that its Starlink network would provide broadband service of at least 100 by 20, with latency below 100 milliseconds. The Bureau approved SpaceX's short-form application, necessarily concluding that Starlink would be reasonably capable of meeting the relevant public interest obligations for each state it selected. It won bids for some $885 million. Did I say billion earlier? It's million. In support over 10 years to serve 19,234 census block groups with 642,925 model locations across 35 states. So they were one of the major winners, one of the top 10. It might have been, if I remember, maybe second or third. SpaceX then timely filed its comprehensive long form, which contained all the information required by the Commission's rules, as well as its letter of credit commitment. In particular, SpaceX's long form confirmed comprehensive technical and financial information establishing that it was capable of meeting its public interest obligations in those areas where it had winning bids. And that was the requirement of the long form, was to go into more detail financially and technically on what they could do. Let's pass through some of these redactions here. The Bureau disregarded Commission policy in the long form review process. As an overarching error, the Bureau improperly applied a presumption of default to SpaceX's application. In other words, they kind of presumed that they were going to fail. This directly contradicted the Commission's directive not to adopt any presumptions or exclude any type of technology. The Commission directed the Bureau to assess whether a long-form applicant is reasonably capable of meeting its performance obligations and provided the Bureau with specific guidance on the scope of its review. The Commission defined reasonably capable to mean a reasonable expectation the applicant can meet those obligations. But instead of assessing the technical and financial information submitted by SpaceX in its long form, Bureau decision, as explained in more detail below, relied on provably inaccurate conclusions, unsupported speculation of future risks, and outside the record evidence with little to no relevance to SpaceX's ability to meet future RDOF obligations. In practice, rather than assessing whether SpaceX was reasonably capable of meeting its performance obligations, the Bureau denied the long form because it was not 100% certain that SpaceX could meet its requirements. This was not the test mandated by the Commission. Sorry, I was going to bring up, I saw some comments here. I'll bring those up so you can see those. In particular, the Bureau represented the Commission's concerns with potential LEO or low Earth orbit satellite broadband providers bidding in the low latency and gigabit bidding tiers to mean the Commission was generally skeptical of LEO satellite systems meeting download, upload speed requirements in any tier. So in other words, they were saying there was definite skepticism on gigabit, and they were kind of applying that to any tier, which again, Starlink bid on the lowest tier, the 100 by 20. But the Commission ultimately decided that LEO satellite systems could participate without any presumptions of default in the above baseline speed tier, which is what SpaceX did. The Bureau's denial of SpaceX's long form was contrary to the evidence, erroneous and unreasonable. Through the voluminous information it submitted into the record via its long form, SpaceX clearly demonstrated that it was reasonably capable from both technical and financial perspectives of meeting its RDOF obligations in its winning bid areas within the timeline set. Then it says SpaceX established that it was more than reasonably capable of meeting its technical RDOF obligations. When the Bureau approved SpaceX's short-form application in 2020, it determined that its Starlink network was technically capable of providing broadband service with speeds of at least 100 by 20 and latency at or below 100 milliseconds round trip. That was true then, and it unquestionably remains true today. In other words, it claims SpaceX had not demonstrated that its Starlink network would have the capability to meet performance obligations in all of its winning bid areas, but that conclusion is unsupported and indeed contradicted by the record. The Bureau inexplicably ignored the evidence in SpaceX's long form that clearly shows the Starlink network will easily meet the applicable performance requirements of SpaceX's winning bid areas by the RDOF milestones starting in 2025. So again, the complaint they have here is that the FCC was looking at Ookla data, and Ookla data, first of all, there was no indication that that would be a factor in whether the FCC would award funding to anybody that had applied for this funding. And again, you could make the case that somebody who's got a DSL network and then is going to be building out fiber, you don't want to be counting on Ookla data in areas where there's DSL, and you don't certainly want to look across the whole country for that provider, because that would be including areas that are maybe slower than some that are slower than others. So that's a big point that they're making there. The Bureau. Yeah, no, that was that. Okay. Let's see. The Bureau did not confront this evidence. Rather, it relied on recent nationwide speed test data from Ookla that was collected between Q4 2021 and Q2 2022 to cast doubt on Starlink's ability to deliver 100 by 20 speeds starting in 2025. First, the Ookla data covers a period of time more than 3 years before SpaceX's first mandatory deployment milestone in 2025. But by 2025, the Starlink network will have substantially more capacity than it did at the time of the speed tests in question. And they can launch these satellites, they're launching them all the time, so they can actually meet these obligations certainly before 3 years. Notably, at the time of Ookla's Q1 measurement, SpaceX had launched less than half of the licensed 4,408 satellites in the Starlink network, and some of those were still in orbit raise and not yet contributing to available capacity. The other thing about Ookla is that the data that it's reporting is going to be dependent on not just the connection that the customer has, but what's going on in their network. How many people are doing stuff on the network at that time, specifically in their home network, but then also what else is going on the network outside of that. Now, this would be directly from them to Starlink. So, that really, a lot of that is under Starlink's control. But I think the biggest thing is maybe Wi-Fi performance. So if you've got an in-home Wi-Fi network that could be congested, that could impact speed. So you don't really want to rely on Ookla if you're making major decisions about what speed customers are actually getting. Second, the Bureau decision ignores that SpaceX was given no notice that its nationwide speeds in 2021 and 2022 would be used as a proxy for determining its ability to meet 2025 speed requirements for RDOF territories. SpaceX was neither advertising nor attempting to offer 100 by 20 megabit per second service during the time period Ookla surveyed the network speeds. So they're saying, we hadn't even said we were doing that. Third, the Bureau relied on Ookla speed test data for the United States as a whole, not SpaceX's winning bid areas. So again, they're looking at, that would be like looking at somebody like a CenturyLink or, let's say a nationwide operator and saying, what are your speeds across the country when they only won specific areas? They'd be looking at the country as a whole, and really they should be looking at those specific areas if they were even going to apply this Ookla data. But SpaceX was not required to take these steps before 2025. First, for all of these reasons, the Ookla data lacks any predictive value in assessing whether SpaceX is reasonably capable of meeting its RDOF performance obligations by 2025. And I made this green, so it's important. Indeed, the Bureau appears to be penalizing SpaceX for making an initial broadband service available to underserved Americans ahead of its RDOF deployment milestones. That's a really good point that they pull out there. In other words, they're already serving, the people who get their service tend to be underserved and unserved people. So they're getting penalized because there's this data where they're serving these people and providing much better service than they were getting before. Even if let's say they're not getting 100 by 20. And, it's been up and down. So when Starlink first opens in an area, people were getting over 100 and close to 20, I think, on the upstream. The upstream's a little harder. But they were getting much better service than they were getting, let's say, when they had DSL and they were maybe only getting 10 megabits per second down, or they didn't even have that. Maybe they just had either, dial-up or geosynchronous satellite, where they had long delays and the speeds weren't very good. So they make a really good point there. Now we get to the redactions that look kind of like the Mar-a-Lago Trump stuff here. So page after page of black lines. Let's see, here we go. As described above, SpaceX's plan for meeting its RDOF performance obligations is built in a considerable margin of error, with no more than some percentage of the network's capacity in the United States ever required to serve its winning bid areas in compliance at the required performance level. So the FCC is getting all of this information, including this redacted stuff and percentages like that. SpaceX established that it was more than reasonably capable of meeting its financial RDOF obligations in its winning bid. The information SpaceX provided to the Bureau establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that SpaceX has a financial ability to meet its RDOF performance obligations in the winning bid areas. The Bureau rationally both overstates the project cost of Starlink deployment during the first 2 years while simultaneously ignoring Starlink revenues. Also plainly erroneous was the Bureau's complete failure to credit or even mention SpaceX's substantial revenues from Starlink when discussing cash flows. Redaction stuff. Third, the timing and nature of any broadband deployment funded through new federal programs in SpaceX's winning bid areas are highly uncertain. Even assuming the federal government does eventually decide to subsidize competitors in SpaceX RDOF territories, that deployment will not come for years. That's a really good point. For example, it will be years before project funding under the NTIA's BEAD program moves from federal sources to state and localities and then to broadband providers to construct actual networks. Finally, in most areas won by SpaceX, it appears no fiber or 1 gigabit per second provider even submitted a bid. And again, they say most, it's just over 50%. But they make a good point here in that these areas, well, they make a good point, and then it's countered by the fact that there's satellites already there. But these areas, even though they'll be, open, they would be open, really, honestly, they would be open for RDOF anyway. Because according to the NTIA rules, I believe according to NOFO, they do not consider satellite of any kind as what they call reliable, is it reliable broadband? There's a particular term for that, which means that a priority broadband project has to be reliable broadband, which was either fiber or it could be fixed wireless if it's all licensed spectrum or obviously cable. But certain technologies, for example, wireless that was on unlicensed spectrum did not qualify and satellite did not qualify. So even if Starlink won this money in these RDOF areas, that would not preclude for any reason a fiber project from coming in and overbuilding that. And the point they're making here is that even if somebody does do that with these funded dollars from BEAD, it's going to be years before that happens. And then you got to build out the network. Now, again, these areas are not left unserved if there are birds above, right? So if Starlink already has satellites above, then the people in these areas can get internet. It's just that it won't be through this program, and it won't have some of the benefits that would be coming if Starlink were included in this program. For example, you have to have a low-cost option. They have to support the affordable connectivity program, so they have to provide subsidies there. So there's some things they would have to do if they accepted, I think, with RDOF. I think they have to do that with RDOF. So maybe not, since that was after the ACP, but I'm mixing up the BEAD and RDOF, so maybe they don't have to do that stuff. But in any event, the satellites are up there, but they're right that any competing technologies, it's going to take years if they're going to rely on the funding from the government through the BEAD program. It says here, of the 19,233 census block groups, yeah, here it is, awarded to SpaceX, 11,000 or 24, or 57.3% did not receive a single gigabit tier bid. And again, I'm assuming that means that nobody bid. It's not like it's saying nobody bid. So it's not like there was a gigabit fiber bid there that lost because Starlink was able to underbid them. It sounds like nobody bid in those areas. Let's see if there's anything else in here. The Bureau ignored the critical role that the Commission assigned to the letter of credit requirement. The Commission directed the Bureau, when evaluating a long-form application, to rely on an eligible bank's willingness to issue the applicant a letter of credit to determine whether an applicant is reasonably capable of meeting its RDOF auction obligations in the specific areas where it has winning bids. The Commission has recognized that a key benefit of requiring letters of credit is that an issuing bank will be performing its own financial review of the winning bidder. That is particularly true for RDOF because issuing banks must make significant bets on the success of RDOF bidders throughout the program. So in other words, you got to get this letter of credit, and that's just another financial check, because these banks are not going to be wanting to do that if it doesn't look like that is a good investment. But the Bureau decision assigned no weight whatsoever to the commitment letter an eligible bank gave to issue SpaceX an irrevocable letter of credit for the amount required by the Commission's rules. The Bureau ignored and implicitly denied SpaceX's timely request to waive the ETC designation deadline. So that's an eligible telecommunications carrier. So RDOF requires not just broadband, that you provide broadband, also that you provide a voice service of some kind over that network. So you have to get an ETC designation in every state, and a lot of times that's handled by the Public Utility Commission. There's different ways that it's done. It's been a problem for some RDOF applications. In some cases, it was the fault of the provider that bid. For example, LTD Broadband, didn't do certain things with ETC designations, so they were not given any waivers. There were a lot of providers, however, that tried their best to get the ETC designation, and because of roadblocks and bureaucracy and other things, they could not get it in the time required. So the FCC came out when they approved the authorized funds for them, and they said, we feel like they presented a good case for us to waive the penalty for not getting the ETC in on time. They did this in good faith, so they waived a lot of those things, but they did not in the case of Starlink. So again, they feel like they're not being treated fairly here. The Bureau decision inexplicitly failed to mention SpaceX's timely filled and well-supported waiver request, let alone consider, discuss, or rule on it. Instead, the Bureau simply stated that SpaceX could not receive support for the areas it won in Hawaii and Mississippi because it had failed to submit proof of ETC status in those states. This was a fundamental procedural error. In other words, they claim they would have a reason for waiver, just like some of these other companies that had reasons for waivers that were awarded that waiver. And then conclusions and requests of relief kind of close it out here. So for all these reasons, the Commission should grant the application for review. Specifically, the Commission should reverse the Bureau decision by finding that SpaceX is reasonably capable of meeting its performance obligations in its winning bid areas. Order the Bureau to grant SpaceX's long form for those states where it has submitted proof of ETC status, and direct the Bureau to grant SpaceX's request for waiver of the deadline to submit evidence of ECT designations in those states where it has yet to receive such designations, because they're claiming they've done everything they can on their end, and they've done that in good faith, and there are things outside of their control. So I had a comment or two, and maybe that person decided they didn't want that comment to be addressed, so I didn't see exactly what it was. But anyway, so they make some really good points here. They can provide, they're providing internet now. This, the concern is, especially from fiber providers, is that this will give people, lesser service if they were granted this RDOF. But in reality, I don't think FCC is going to come out and issue any more RDOF funds. I think that's over. With all the money that's out there now, I think it's all going to be the BEAD program. And the BEAD program does not consider satellite as a reliable broadband service. So if there is a fiber operator that wants to get funds in a particular area that Starlink wins, and they were to get that money, then there's nothing preventing that operator from getting BEAD funds, because it's not considered reliable broadband. And if the state determines that that's the best solution, then it won't matter that satellite's there. So, and they make some really good points here as to how this was not handled, maybe even-handedly, and how they accepted, outside information, outside the record, whether that was from lobbying efforts from other providers, Ookla data, that kind of thing. So, you gotta look at it fairly, and it'll be interesting to see what the FCC does do about this, if they do decide to look at this seriously. Thanks for joining me. Hopefully this was interesting. If so, please give me a thumbs up on the video. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. Click the little subscribe button somewhere on the video or down on YouTube, and click the bell to be notified when I'm live. And I'll see you next time for Broadband Deployment News. Take care. Bye-bye.